The Principal Cause of Death. Author Mark Richard Zubero. Publisher St. Martin's Press, New York. Narrator Eric Ost. For Michael in learning the meaning of friendship. Acknowledgements. For their invaluable assistance, I wish to thank Mike Kushner, Peg Panzer, Rick Paul, and Kathy Pekaserid. Chapter 6. I remember bits and pieces of the next few hours. I know Scott stood next to me, his closeness providing comfort. A couple of firemen eventually recognized him and tried to come over and talk, but he waved them away. Somebody handed us coffee and sandwiches. I only took a couple of bites before throwing mine away. Finally, the last fire truck set at the top of the driveway. 10 feet from the damp and blackened embers, I found myself sitting next to Scott in the front seat of his car. "It's 3 a.m, Scott said. "We should go. There's nothing you can do here." His voice was its softest and most soothing. "In a few minutes," I said. I got out of the car and walked to the place that had been my home for 15 years. The smell of smoke and ash permeated the air. Under my feet, the ground had been turned to mud by the water the firemen poured in their vain attempt to stem the flames. A fireman met me a few feet from the house. He was a roly-poly man about 25 years old. "Mr. Mason," he said, "there's nothing you can do here for now. It's still too dangerous for you to go in. We're going to stay here a while longer. We think it's out, but we always like to be sure. There'll be an arson investigation in the morning." "Was it arson?" I asked. He looked doubtful. "I'm not the expert," he said, "but it sure was caught good when we got here." "Arson," I said. I began to walk around the house. The fireman said, "Here, Mr. Mason, I wish you wouldn't. I could get in trouble if you hurt yourself." I promised not to go next to the house. I just want to walk around. I noticed Scott was beside me. He accompanied me as I took the most painful journey of my life. Opposite where the back door used to be, I stopped. I said, "You know what I'll miss the most?" "What?" Scott asked quietly. "The first gift you gave me. I've saved it all these years. You bought it back from Japan that first October. You remember that silk rose? It was unique. They only make them like that over there. It was so beautiful. Now it's gone." Scott said what needed to be said. "Be thankful we weren't in there. We're alive. That's what counts, and you've got a place to stay." I glanced at him in the darkness of the now cool night. "I know that's true," I sighed. "I don't care about the expensive stuff. It's the irreplaceable stuff. Pictures of us together on vacations. Family stuff." I was too tired and in too much shock to cry. "If it was arson," I began. Scott interrupted. "If it was arson, we'll find the person and make them sorry." "If it was arson," I said, "I know who it was. Dan Bluefield." In the car on the way to the city, I raged about Dan Bluefield. How Scott kept silent so long, I'll never know. He didn't tell me to shut up or to give it a rest. He let me fulminate all the way to where we exited Lakeshore Drive at LaSalle Street. I finally wound down as we left the drive. I sat in the penthouse library surrounded on 3 sides by the floor-to-ceiling bookcases. The fourth wall consisted of windows looking north toward Lincoln Park. I didn't turn on any of the lights, but stared out at the darkness. Scott's building is the tallest around, so the view to the rest of the world is never obstructed. He came into the room in jeans and socks. He touched my hand lightly. "Do you want to try to get some sleep?" he asked. "It's okay," I said. "I won't be able to sleep anyway. I'll just sit here. Maybe I'll try to read something later." He patted my shoulder and said goodnight. After he left, I walked to the window for a long time. I stared out, watching the cars move far below. Around 5:30, I tried to find something to read to blank out my mind. I placed a Jean Redpath CD into the machine, hoping her soft Scottish burr might help soothe me to sleep. Every time I thought I might be nodding off, the vision of the flames leaping out my bedroom window flashed through my mind. The words on the pages held no sense for me. I thought about the items I'd miss, the other gifts from Scott, a stuffed Eeyore from our first Christmas, a pewter Lord of the Rings chess set, the scroll of a love poem he'd written for our 10th anniversary, the dowdy throw pillow we brought in the south of France. The pillow had our names hand embroidered along with obscene comments in French about lovemaking between two men. Most of the stuff was not very expensive, just irreplaceable. I watched the light of the rising sun slowly spread over the cityscape below. It was Saturday, so there was no school. I wouldn't have gone anyway. At 8, I found a diet soda in the refrigerator in the kitchen, and then I looked in on Scott. He slept peacefully on his stomach. I gazed at his broad shoulders, uncovered by the blanket, then traced the lines of his still-covered torso, down the sensuous curves of his thighs and hips, down his long, muscular legs. I let him sleep. I returned to the library, sipped the diet soda, and curled up with a volume of Wordsworth's collected poems, guaranteed at any normal time to put me to sleep in less than 5 minutes. At some point, Wordsworth must have worked his magic, because I came wide awake at the ringing of the phone. I glanced at the clock on the dark oak desk. It was just after 9:30. My head felt numb and my body ached from sleeping in the chair. I snatched the phone off the stand on the third ring. It was Hank Daniels from the River's Edge Police. He offered condolences and said, "I got in earlier, saw the report on the night log. I went out to the fire scene, just got back. It was arson. You need to come in so we can talk." As I was finishing my conversation, Scott walked in, dressed only in jockey shorts. "Who was it?" he asked after I hung up. I told him. He looked at the clock. "Did you get any sleep?" About an hour." "You're in no condition to go running around town. You need to get some rest. Relax. It's going to be hard enough to go back there and check for anything you can salvage, although I don't guess there'll be much." "Let me take a shower," I said. "I'll be ready to go. Somebody burned my home, and I'm going to make them pay." I felt last night's anger returning. Only now it wasn't fury, it was cold determination to find and punish the perpetrator. Scott insisted we stop for breakfast. First, we ate thick French toast at Nookie's on Wells Street. Then we went out to River's Edge. We stopped at the police station with the trees in full color around it. The old place almost looked respectable in the starkness of winter. It would be revealed for what it was, a run-down rat trap. Daniels and Johnson met us at the front desk and took us to a gray interrogation room. "Do you think this is connected to the murder?" Scott asked. Daniels said, "Cops have an instinct that says never believe in coincidences. This is too much of one. We know you've been talking to people in the faculty about the murder. We want to know what you found out." For half an hour, they barraged us with questions. I was too angry and tired to be reasonable. Often I felt my temper rise, especially when at one point they seemed to be implying that we might have set the fire ourselves. But Scott's calm managed to remind me to take it easy. Finally, I said, "I'm the one who's had his house burned down. You said it was arson. I'm the victim. I refuse to be treated as if I'm guilty. Let's get my lawyer in here and we can all have a nice chat." Daniel said, "We're simply asking the standard questions we would in any arson investigation." I was only slightly mollified by that statement. I wished Frank Murphy was back from vacation. Daniels continued, "What you've done since the murder, and we know you've been questioning people, may have angered somebody with a guilty secret. Whoever set the fire may have thought you were at home. Your truck, Mr. Mason, was in full view back by the barn." I used the old barn part-time as a garage with so much harvesting equipment being used in the area. The farmer who owns the fields had asked me if he could store some of it in the barn. Fortunately, the truck was far enough away from the house not to get caught in the conflagration of the night before. If it was Bluefield, he'd have only seen me driving that to school. He wouldn't have known about the Porsche," I said. "Do you really think the kid did it?" Daniels asked. "Yes! And I don't think it had anything to do with the murder. I think the kid is fucking nuts and he'd do anything to hurt me. That's going to stop today." "Don't do anything stupid," Daniels warned. Before I could retort, Scott asked, "Do they know how it started?" Daniels said, Once they started looking this morning, it didn't take long. Molotov cocktails through the windows, one in the bedroom, one in the kitchen. No other clues so far. With all the fire equipment around the place last night, they won't find any footprints or tire tracks. You don't have a lot of neighbors, but those few will be asked if they saw anything. I doubt if they did. With all the corn around your place still unharvested, it would have been difficult for anyone to see anything close to the house. Daniels added, 2 things you might be interested to know. First, we went to the Bluefield house to question the kid about the arson. Second, we don't believe him about seeing you outside the principal's office. Thanks, I said. Don't misunderstand, Johnson said. You're still our chief suspect. Scott's hand on my arm forestalled a comment. He asked, did the kid have an alibi for last night? He was at home, so he says, and his old man backs him up. Mr. Bluefield was quite self-righteous and self-satisfied about your home burning down. The kid didn't say a lot. We questioned him about the murder again. The kid's a jerk and would make a lousy witness. That doesn't sound like a ringing endorsement of my innocence, I said. Sounding more reasonable than he had so far, Daniel said, we've got to ask questions. It's not a polite job, and you are a good suspect. People have been convicted based on only one of the things you're accused of. Last one to see a victim alive, fights with the victim the day he dies, finds the dead body, has blood on his shirt. I began to list the arguments against these reasons. Daniels held up a hand. Save it. You aren't under arrest, although you could be for obstructing justice. So far, we haven't gotten any complaints about your interference. Nobody willing to press charges or say anything nasty, which is lucky for you. If these people are talking, they seem to trust you. Learning all that information can be dangerous, so can fucking with the cops. So don't try it. I'm not Frank Murphy, and his word only goes so far around here, so I'd be careful if I were you. We said nothing to this, and a few minutes later they let us go. We drove to my house. When Scott pulled up the driveway, the sight of the ruin by the light of day hit me hard. The investigation team was just about finished, so I was allowed to prowl carefully through the ruins. The basement stairs had been destroyed. Little remained of the furniture. Globs of plastic were all that remained of the electronics room. Computers, stereo, CD player. The place smelled as black and depressing as it looked. Scott followed me silently. His calm presence got me through the inspection. I didn't find one salvageable thing. I stood in the middle of the blackened ruin and felt all the helplessness and powerlessness of the night before, back again, and redoubled. But those feelings had a companion. This morning, a towering fury. I'd get whoever did this. We had dirt and soot all over our clothes, so we went to the barn to change. We'd brought spare clothes with us because we knew we'd be stopping at the house. When I finished dressing and reopened the door to look out on the field of corn surrounding the ruin, I said, "We're going to Bluefields." Scott said, "Fine." I turned back to look at him. "I thought you'd object," I said. "No," he said. Usually Scott's the reasonable one in our relationship, the one who insists we stop, think, and consider all options. From 10 years of knowing him, I could tell that his no contained all the fury of someone ready to do battle. I mentioned earlier he doesn't lose his temper often, but when he does, it's spectacular. I didn't envy Dan Bluefield his chances when we caught up with him. We stopped at school. There is rarely a day or time that some group isn't using the school during off hours. Everybody from the Cub Scouts to the Park District uses the complex for meetings or games. I needed to stop in the office to find Bluefield's address. We found Carolyn sitting at Jones's desk and told her about the fire. "This is too much," she said. She looked us over. "You're all right?" We nodded. "Could you save anything?" I told her about our visit to the scene this morning. "I'm sorry," was her response. I asked carefully about the people we'd talked to so far. She gave no hint of knowing any of the secrets we'd uncovered. Jones had kept his promises to say nothing. We left her at the principal's office trying to do that job as well as her own. They'd have one of the assistants as a temporary replacement, but even she would need to be trained in the outer office. I picked up the phone. "Who are you calling?" Scott asked. "Meg. I've got an idea about finding out where all our suspects were last night." First, I told Meg about the fire. She was instantly sympathetic and horrified, and then angry. She insisted we come over to her house. I assured her we were okay and told her we were going to question the Bluefields, but that we needed her help with something else. I barely got the suggestion started before she picked up on it. I'll do all the calls. Leave it to me. I've got the old grapevine going. I haven't been this involved in ages, but I'll find out where all of them were. I wasn't Gossip Central for years for nothing. Don't forget to be discreet, I reminded her. You must be really tired, she said, to think that I need to be reminded about discretion. Trust me. I did trust her, so I shut up. We got Bluefield's address from my desk files and drove over. They lived in a modified Cape Cod on a cul-de-sac in the oldest part of River's Edge. The neighborhood had been built before tract houses became the rage. They didn't have sidewalks but drained ditches along both sides of the road. The large spaces between the houses were remnants of the area's recent rural past. The home itself looked to have had several recent expensive renovations. We stormed up to the door, prepared to do battle. We knocked and pounded. Nobody answered. We walked around the house. No cars in the driveway. We peered through a small window into the garage. Empty. A dog in the house on the right barked at us as we walked back to the front. Standing on the lawn, we mulled over the possibilities. They had fled. We just missed them. They were hiding in the house. Since we were getting nowhere, I figured we might as well find out everything I could about the Bluefields. A curtain moved in the house on the right, and a minute later, a man emerged from inside. A large German shepherd accompanied him out the door. The house had 2 stories and was more than substantial. The man plodded through the leaves being dropped by the massive oaks throughout the neighborhood. He stood well over 6'6", with gray hair and muscles still not gone, too fat. He must have been in his mid-50s. He stopped when he got to us without a command that I could see. The dog immediately sat next to him, on his left. "Looking for the Bluefields?" he asked. We said yes. He stared at Scott. We got the recognition issue out of the way. Then the man said, "They took off together. The old man and the boy, about 7 this morning. Mrs. Bluefield left about 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes ago." "Any idea where they went?" I asked. "No, the boy in some kind of trouble again. I'd heard he'd reformed. Haven't had any trouble with him myself for quite a while." "We just want to question him," I said. "I'm his English teacher." "He still goes to school?" "I'm a little surprised at that. Of course, you're not the first teacher, social worker, administrator, or cop to come over trying to talk to him. That family's had a parade of folks through here over the years. Has to be all the kids needs is a new set of parents and a swift kick in the rear." "You must know a lot," Scott said. He invited us into his home for coffee. We sat in the kitchen, a built-in microwave, attesting to its modernity. He ground the coffee himself. The aroma was wonderful and the coffee delicious. We talked baseball for a while before returning to the subject of the neighbors. The dog sat next to his master's chair, head on paws as if listening to our whole conversation. The man told us he didn't want us to think he was a busybody, but he'd been a neighbor of the Bluefield since he moved into the neighborhood 5 years ago. Trouble. That's the one word that sums them up the best. Father's an unreconstructed hippie, sells drugs out of the house, I'm sure. "Police know about that?" I asked. "Hell yes. They come to get the dad a couple of times. I think he served a few months in prison a couple of years back." "How about the mother?" Scott asked. "The cops took her a few times. If the mister isn't home, she takes care of the customers. I don't think she's ever actually been arrested, at least not while I've lived here." "You had any trouble with him?" I asked. He laughed, then said, "Who hasn't? Talk to everybody. They'll have horror stories to tell. My time came about a month after I moved in here. One night, my electricity failed, and I figured it was a blackout, but I looked outside, and everybody else's lights were still on. I thought that was odd, so I went outside to check the circuit breakers in the garage. Out in the darkness, I heard shouts of, 'Whip! Jerk! Fool!' Other idiotic shit. I found a window broken in the side door of the garage. They'd gotten in and turned off all the circuits. I looked around, but whoever it was ran off. Next day, I replaced the glass, found to be more vigilant, maybe look into a security system. Although one of the reasons I moved out here was to avoid that kind of thing. I was plenty pissed." He drained his coffee cup, refilled it, and offered us more. "Same damn thing happened the next night. I stuck my head out the back door and the name-calling continued. I came back in and called the police." He hunched himself closer to the table and smiled. "I enjoy this next part," he said. "With all the lights out, whoever it was couldn't see me sneak out the front door. I'd heard the direction the shouts came from. I walked around the block and came up through the backyards. I wound up 10 feet behind two kids. The cop car pulled up my driveway with the siren off, but with the lights flashing. The kids backed right up into me. I grabbed them both. One managed to squirm away. I held on to the other one. It was little Dan Bluefield, 13 years old. "What'd you do?" Scott asked. "I'm an ex-cop. Worked the 12th District in Chicago. One of the toughest in the city. I yanked the shit out of the little bastard. I know a few tricks about hurting someone without leaving scars or bruises. Almost pulled the kid's hair out by the roots. I had the boy in tears almost before I started. He cried and blubbered. I told him if anything ever happened to my home, I'd blame him and come looking for him. Never had any trouble since then." "Why not set the dog on him?" I asked. "Didn't have Fido then. Got him a few weeks later. They retired him from police work. He got hurt pretty badly in his last bust. They were going to destroy him, but with the help of a good vet, I nursed him back to health. I'm sure that over the years he's helped convince the kid to back off." We left a few minutes later as we contemplated which houses to go to next to ask questions. Scott asked, "Fido. He named his dog Fido?" "Guy that big can name his dog Amethusta Gertrude Gahugan if he wants to. Nobody's going to argue with him or that dog. Besides, somebody's got to name their dog Fido." We tried the tan brick ranch house to the left of the Bluefields. A couple in their late 20s talked to us in their living room. We did the obligatory baseball chat. They hadn't seen the Bluefields this morning. They repeated the stories about police visits and drugs. The woman said, "Sometimes the buyers just drive up in their cars and toot their horns. Whoever's home, mom, dad, the kid, runs out, takes care of business." "And the police do nothing?" Scott asked. They shrugged. She said, "We've reported them once. The police came, saw nothing happening, took our names, talked to the Bluefields, and arrested nobody." He said, "That's when we started having trouble. We found garbage, food, all over our front porch. This happened several times over a period of 4 weeks. We called the police once. We told them we suspected the Bluefields. The police talked to them. We kept watch the next few nights, but even alternating watches, we lost too much sleep. We both have jobs. The second time, we didn't keep watch. We woke to find garbage all over the front lawn." She said, "It was terrible. It took over a day to clean it up. I felt that awful Mr. Bluefield watching me all day long. His son came out and stood a step off our property for over an hour. He didn't say anything, just stared and sneered. It scared me. We didn't call the police after that. Eventually it stopped. We thought about moving, but we just can't. We could barely afford the down payment on this place." Next, we tried the neighbors on the street directly behind the Bluefields. This turned out to be an older couple, probably in their 70s. The woman had grown up in the house, then came back to live in it after her parents died. Introducing ourselves did not cause a spat of baseball recognition. They weren't fans. It was refreshing. They, too, had their trouble with the notorious Bluefields. Living behind them, they'd missed a lot of the drug selling that went on out front. "Spray paint," the woman told us. "We're Jewish for years. We had no trouble. Our kids grew up. We gave them a good Jewish upbringing. Everything was fine, just like you'd expect it to be in America. Then it started. Swastikas on the garage door. Cruel things on the sides of the house. The police were kind, but couldn't do anything. We tried watching ourselves." He said, "We talked to some friends who had some trouble at one of the synagogues up in Chicago. I guess I can tell you this." He looked to his wife for confirmation. She nodded her head yes. "They sent some people out to watch for us. People who knew how to watch. They sent us on vacation. When we came back, our garage was totally repainted. We suspected there'd been trouble. The leader of the group reported to us they'd repainted the garage. They'd also caught who did it, the Bluefields. They told us they didn't think there'd ever be trouble again, but if there was, to call them. We asked if we should call the police. I remember the man smiled at me and said we could if we wanted, but he didn't think it would help." The woman smiled broadly and said, "We didn't ask any more, and there hasn't been any trouble since. If we ever see the Bluefield boy at the local store or anywhere around town, he goes out of his way to be polite to us." No one answered in the first two houses across the street from the Bluefields. So far, people had horror stories to tell, but couldn't give us a clue to where the Bluefields were or when they might be back. The third house across the street, this one a red brick ranch, had a different story. When she found out what we wanted, the woman, who was in her early 40s, swept us into the house. She had long red fingernails carefully tended and wore a Chicago Bulls warm-up outfit, right down to a pair of Air Jordans. She sat down and talked with very little prodding from us. That boy dated my daughter last year. I didn't say anything. You know how contrary kids can be at that age. Tell them yes and they want no, or vice versa. Makes no difference. If mom likes it, it's got to be awful. So I kept my mouth shut. My girl went through hell. I watched as carefully as I could. I knew the stories about drugs over there. Sheer chance that she took a camping trip with some friends and met a nice boy from Makina. She broke up with Dan Bluefield. He started harassing her. We called the police. We started getting obscene phone calls. We got a tap in here, but you know the phone company will only put on one in for 2 weeks. I hadn't known that. The 15th day, the call started again. I went nuts with the phone company. They put on another tap, of course. You know what happened. Day 15, they started again. Then I guess Julie, that's my daughter, told her boyfriend he's on the football team at Lincoln Way High School. Julie wouldn't tell me the whole story, but from what she said, I guess her new boyfriend got some of his buddies, and they paid Dan a visit. The call stopped after that. She didn't know where Dan or the parents might be. Would Julie know? I asked. She won't be back until late this afternoon. You're welcome to come back then and ask her. We thanked her and told her we'd drop by later. We stopped for lunch at the McDonald's on LaGrange Road in Frankfort. It was 2:30, so the place was uncrowded. One fan asked for an autograph. None of the teenage servers recognized Scott. When you pitch 2 no-hitters in the World Series and bring a baseball championship to Chicago for the first time in decades, it's an oddity when you aren't recognized. It took us 3 minutes to drive to Meg's in Frankfort. She lives in one of the beautiful Victorian homes in the old section of town. She fussed over us, concerned about how we were coping with the aftermath of the fire. I told her I was concentrating my emotions on investigating the Bluefields and that apart from being tired from lack of sleep, I was okay. We sat in the living room, which was done in blue. The couch and love seat a deep navy with minute stars grouped in rectangles. The rug a light blue, tending to turquoise. There was one large framed print of a sailing ship on each wall. We told Meg about talking to the Bluefields' neighbors. She said, I'm not surprised about what you found. A totally dysfunctional family. Then she added, I've got the information on where everybody was. That quick? I asked. She patted my hand. My dear, used to be half the time. I knew things before people even did them. The old gossip gathering skills aren't that rusty. I smiled at her. She went on. We've got everybody present and accounted for. Everybody has a solid alibi. None of the murder suspects could have set the fire. Except the Bluefield kid, Scott said. I couldn't find out anything about any of the Bluefields, Meg said. Scott said, a couple of the neighbors and the girl, Julie's boyfriend, and his buddies managed to successfully scare Bluefield. Now he's graduated to attacks like those on Tom. He's maturing, Meg said. Maybe his next level is full-time drug dealer or hitman. Who knows? Then she added, Kirk Campbell and I have been doing some checking together, trying to find out if anybody besides the teachers you talked to had problems with Jones. I've been concerned about the possibility of a teacher whose difficulties with Jones we didn't know about, or even someone totally unrelated to who and what we'd found so far, having simply showed up at school, killed Jones, and left undetected. We couldn't think of one or find one. We did some pretty extensive and very discreet checking, of course. Kurt would know most of the problems anyway. I thanked her for the help. We stayed until it was time for us to go back to talk to Dan, Bluefield's ex-girlfriend. We drove slowly past the Bluefields. It was nearly 6 and beginning to get dark. No cars in the driveway and no lights on in the house. We pulled up to the girlfriend's. She met us at the door, haircut short. She wore jeans and a pale orange sweatshirt. Her mother joined us in the living room. The 17-year-old took a while to get over the fact that Scott Carpenter was sitting in her living room. I didn't recognize her from school, which isn't unusual in a school with over 3,000 kids. We explained what we needed to know. She looked thoughtful, tucked a leg under her, and then said, I dated that creep for 3 months. I don't know what I saw in him. He was hateful so much of the time. She shuddered. Then I met Darren. She gave us much the same version of the breakup with Bluefield and subsequent harassment as the mother had. Where could he be right now? I asked. A couple of places he hangs out with friends. I asked if she could give us the names and addresses. She did so with alacrity. I hope you make the creep miserable, she said, as she wrote them down. At the door, while we were leaving, she said, if you try those and he's not there, you might try the forest preserve on Route 30, just east of Wolf Road. Him and his buddies sometimes got together there to hang out, drink beer, and harass people. We thanked her and left. The addresses she gave us were in Frankfurt Square, Tinley Park, Orland Park, and Makina. We struck out at all three of them. Want to try the forest preserve? Scott asked. Why not? Although I think it closes at dusk. It was nearly 8 and full dark at the entrance to the park. A chain barred our way. Scott turned the Porsche around, prepared to leave, but I caught a light among the trees. Somebody's there, I said. He lit the car idle and looked back. Where? He said. I don't see anything, I pointed. I don't see anything, he repeated. He began to turn back, but I said, wait. We both stared for a few minutes, then it came again. Glow of a cigarette being puffed, I said. Never forget how that looks in the dark, not after being in the Marines. Let's investigate. Scott said, there can't be any cars in there. The chain's on, or if there is somebody, it's got to be official people who have a right to be there. It's our last lead, I said. I opened the door and got out. Will you wait? He asked. I'm going to move the car away from the entrance. I don't want the police coming in and investigating what the hell we're doing here. He drove the car about 30 feet down the road and parked it behind a screen of trees. The area of the forest preserve closest to the road was mostly open field, with picnic tables interspersed around outdoor grills. We crossed this quickly. Lights from the cars passing by on Route 30 lit the way enough to the edge of the tree so we wouldn't trip over ourselves. As we entered the woods and got deeper inside, we moved more carefully. Leaves rustled underfoot. A light breeze had sprung up, carrying a stray leaf or two with it. The perfect autumn weather held. We found a road that wound through the woods and tied to stay on its edge. This way we avoided rustling leaves with our passage, but could leap into the foliage if someone came along. Taking the road made the search longer, since it wasn't a direct route toward the light we'd seen. Finally, we spotted a car in the distance, but no lights around it. Careful, I whispered to Scott. We crept up on it quietly. 10 feet from the rear bumper, I said, I don't think there's anybody in it. We made it all the way to the back fender without arousing any suspicion or seeing anyone up close. A rack of lights on the top gave us the news. Scott found it necessary to say, It's a cop car. I rested a hand on the fender and peered into the darkness surrounding us. What's it doing here? I asked. Sitting parked, he said. I love him dearly, but there are times the man could use a good whap outside the head. I inched around to the side door and raised my head slowly until I could see inside. It was empty. I returned to him and reported its uninhabited state. He whispered, Let's get the hell out of here before the cop returns. Suddenly, a light flashed in the distance on the right side of the road. We heard a giggle. The light stayed on. We could make out a path toward where the light shone. We moved slowly along the dirt, fortunately. A well-used way with few leaves. After a few yards, we saw a clearing and 2 people, a man and a woman, both mostly naked. We saw him fumbling in the light in his discarded pants. He murmured, I know I have a condom in here somewhere. We heard a sigh of satisfaction, and he reached over and snapped off the flashlight in the darkness. I saw a tiny ember of ash nestled in a hollow of dirt. We waited several giggles worth and backed away. Well, Sherlock, Scott said as we strode carefully further down the asphalt drive, your ability to track the evildoers seems to be a little rusty. I whispered back, Light of my life, angel of my existence, true love forever. Shut the fuck up. He had the nerve to chuckle. We proceeded in silence for 15 minutes. Finally he said, I think the path is doubling back toward the entrance. It must make a complete circle. Only those 2 lovebirds are here. I grabbed his arm. There! I pointed to the spot in the distance. He hesitated. It's just them again, he said. No, car on the road, I said. It's somebody else. This is wavering light, not a steady one for a flashlight, but it's not from a cigarette either. We found no path this time, so our progress through the leaves was slower. As we neared our goal, we heard raucous voices with a background of the thump of softly played rock music. They kept no watch, obviously feeling that they were alone. Fortunately, they were loud enough so that The leaves we disturbed didn't arouse any suspicion. We inched our way forward and crouched behind a tree at the edge of the light. Up close, we could observe the group. The light came from 2 candles sitting on top of a boom box. I also saw the glow of 2 cigarette butts, cupped in sheltering hands. I quickly corrected that observation when both butts were passed around. Pot. I counted 6 people. They talked and laughed unconcernedly. Being observed or caught seemed the furthest thing from their minds. 3 sat on a blanket on the ground, the others perched on top of a picnic table. The one closest to me on the table was maybe 10 feet away. I saw him in profile, razor thin with his hair permed. Had to be Dan Bluefield. This was confirmed a minute later when he said, "This is great stuff. The new shipment we got in today is the best we've gotten in a while." A female voice I didn't recognize issued from one of the people on the ground. "Your dad is so cool. I wish mine was like that. Getting drugs anytime you want." Bluefield gave a contented laugh. Another voice, this one male, said, "I think it's even better the way he came to school to try and get that faggot Mason fired. It's so great when your dad backs you up against those stupid teachers." "Don't say faggot," a third voice said. He got hooted and sneered at and called several names. He defended himself by saying, "Lay off my uncle's gay. He's cool. You shouldn't talk that way." The rest spent several minutes belittling the concept of tolerance. The first female voice switched the topic slightly when she said, "Did you guys hear about Mason's house burning?" "The faggot got what he deserved," Bluefield said. "You should have seen what I did to him yesterday." The teenager explained in vivid detail about depositing the dead rat and other debris on my desk. He got a few squeals of "yuck" amid the general sounds of approval. As I listened to his casual explanation and mocking laughter, I felt horrific anger building inside me. They discussed the fire. The conclusion they came to was, "Too bad I didn't die in the fire, too." "The hope of America," Scott murmured. He spoke softly and next to my ear, but the 6 teenagers were immediately silent. "What was that?" one said. "Quiet," another said. Someone blew out the candles. The radio clicked off. It was difficult to see in the dimness, but I thought one of the figures moved toward where we were hidden. I reached back for Scott and found he wasn't there. I hadn't heard him move. Suddenly his voice rang out from 10 feet to my left. "Everybody freeze!" His deep voice rang with the authority of any television cop. The teenagers only hesitated a second. Bluefield yelled, "Run!" A figure came right toward me. As it ran past, I reached out from my hiding place and grabbed. The person struggled fiercely. I felt a cast on one arm. "Bluefield!" My anger flared. I slammed the body against the ground. Moments later, I heard footsteps close by. Scott said, "Tom?" "I think I've got Bluefield," I said between gasps. The kid heard our voices and his struggles redoubled. He got the arm with the cast on it loose for a second and swung it at me. I caught it and began to twist. He squealed in pain and stopped struggling. I listened carefully. No sound of the others. None of them had stayed to see the aftermath. A minute later, we heard the sound of a truck or van starting. I said, "There go your buddies." Bluefield snarled at me. Scott held the kid while I made my way to the picnic table, stumbling only once in the dimness. I felt the service of the table. I knocked something over, patted the table, and picked up an object. Seconds later, a wavering flame from a cigarette lighter lit the area. I swung it around to get a view of the clearing. Scott brought the kid to the table. As soon as he got close enough, Bluefield kicked out at me. I caught his leg and twisted it. He gave a yelp and stopped struggling. "What if he tried to call for help?" Scott asked. "Fine. It would be great to have the cops show up. He'll be nice and quiet. His friends are gone." I found a plastic bag filled with marijuana on the ground. Nearby, I looked at Bluefield and said, "Tell me about the new shipment." "Fuck you," Bluefield said. "I think it's time for a manners lesson." I said, "Let's sit him down." The kid struggled and I was hampered by my cut arm, but eventually we jammed his ass onto the bench. We secured him to the table with our belts and sat on either side of him. "What are you going to do, molest me?" he asked. "Nothing that simple," I said. Bluefield jerked his head in Scott's direction. "I'm going to let your boyfriend do it? Aren't you man enough?" I looked over at Scott. I'd relit the candles. The flickering light certainly wasn't enough to allow Bluefield to recognize Scott, although at this point, that wasn't a major concern. Scott said, "If you don't shut up, I'm going to shove your head so far up your ass, you'll be spitting shit." Bluefield said, "Fuck you," and spat in Scott's face. An instant later, Bluefield bent over, spitting blood or teeth onto the ground. I'm not sure I saw Scott's first fist move. I did see him blowing on his knuckles. I grabbed a handful of Bluefield's curls and yanked his head back. The light was good enough for me to see blood issuing from both a split lip and his nose. You don't get it yet, Bluefield, I said. See, the faggots have captured you, and there are no witnesses. We can do anything we want. We can make it hurt, and we can make you suffer just as much as we want. I'd bet any money your friends won't come back, so it's just us, and you're like all bullies. When you're confronted, your true coward nature oozes from every pore. His defiance at this point passed the realm of stupidity. He spat in my face. I did move, and this time I saw Scott's fist. That was because it took the kid a second to turn away from me. Once again he bent over, spitting debris from his mouth. Again I yanked him up by his curls. I said, "They taught us a few things in the service. I got caught by the Viet Cong once, learned a few interesting things from them before I escaped. I think we should try a few of those on you tonight." Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.